Hi everyone, nubkeks here, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about your first big and difficult decision in Raid Shadow Legends, which is who your starter champion should be. Which one is the best? Who should you choose? And this is updated for 2022 because things have, I think, definitely changed a little bit over the years with some balance changes and stuff like that. So it's a little bit different now. And I want to break it down for you. This is going to be a bit of a nerdy video, so spoiler warning up front, it's going to be a bit nerdy. And ultimately, I think that two of these champions are a bit weaker, and I would not really recommend that you choose them anymore. And two of these champions I think are very good and would get my seal of recommendation, and I'll give you my ultimate best choice here as well, and I'm going to explain why and show you in detail why too, including some secret stats that aren't in the game that you need to dig into the game files to find, and it's kind of crucial to understanding how that game actually works and to being really good at the game and getting further and doing better and all the rest. Let's dive into the game. I'm just going to go through these in order of worst to best, and then I'm going to show you the secret stats and show you why. So I think the worst starter is actually the one I started off with, and that is Galek. He's the orc. Galek, all of the starters, by the way, have an aura, 15% ally HP in all battles. Great starting off, does get replaced reasonably quickly, maybe a month or so into the game. You'll definitely have champions with better auras, like speed auras, for example, which are better. But this is a good place to start you off, and it works in every area of the game. Galek, there's sort of like a standard theme to all of the starters. They all have an A1 with no cooldown that just does a single target hit. Attacks one enemy 2 times, cross slash. They all have a 3-turn cooldown big AoE hit, and this is their big draw that makes them really pop, makes them really cool. Hellraiser for him, attacks all enemies, an extra 15% chance of inflicting a critical hit, puts 30% increased speed on him as well for 2 turns, and then he also has, every single one of these starters has a move that's a bit different, that sort of defines them, that sets them apart. For Galek, obviously I rank him as the worst, so I think this is the weakest one. A 5-turn cooldown on Cursed Blade that attacks 4 times at random, has a 30% chance of putting 30% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns, and then a 30% chance of placing 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. That's a tongue twister, if the target has more than 2 debuffs on them. This books up to a 40% chance of putting those debuffs. So it's a decent chance. You get 40% chances to place it. It's not too bad. What does Galek do well, and what is his weakness? We're going to see when I show you the numbers, but one weakness is his A1, his single target hit, his filler move is actually a bit weak, so that's definitely a weakness. It doesn't do as much damage as the other starters, just straight up. So single target damage falters a bit. His A2 Hellraiser is actually really good. This is, by a small margin, the hardest hitting AoE of all the starters, so that's quite nice. He's going to really excel in the arena or in campaign, just nuking down those waves, for example. And the speed buff is actually pretty good, right? The speed buff's pretty good. If you don't have a speed buff on your team, it's going to help him take more turns and get more damage out. Cursed Blade is pretty weak. It's a long cooldown. It's a random hitter as well, which I don't personally like. It does good single target damage if you're fighting just one enemy. And then one of the big issues is that, well, decreased defense is actually one of the best debuffs in the game. But the problem is that this is a team game, okay? You're going to be building teams. And seeing as this is one of the best debuffs in the game, you are absolutely going to have a champion specifically designed for that. So again, beginner tip here. In the campaign, you can get another rare. So she's super easy to get. It's War Maiden. As you can see, she's wearing lots of clothes, but ignore that. But she has Crumbling Blast. This is an AoE attack on a 3-turn cooldown when it's booked. When booked, that has a 100% chance of putting 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns on all enemies. And pro tip, one of your best starting teams that you can put together is going to be War Maiden. Give her gear so that she's a bit faster than your starter. She does her Crumbling Blast on the 3-turn cooldown, and then your starter comes in. They do their big AoE hit on their 3-turn cooldown, which does huge damage because all the enemy's defense has been decreased, and boom, boom. 1-2, punch, you're good, right? That's your starting sort of combo. So I think Galek is a bit weak, right? He's just not bringing too much that's useful. One other thing to point out, let me jump to, I think is the second worst, and this may surprise you because she's actually considered by most people to be pretty good. One thing to consider as well, I haven't talked about their base stats, but all of your starters have pretty much the same base stats. Now, in order to land debuffs like that decreased defense, or like this weakened debuff that Aethel can place on her A1, you need to build accuracy on your champions, and they basically need to have as much accuracy as the enemy has resistance. The general rule of thumb when you're looking at dungeons, and you can track your progress in dungeons through the game, you want about 10 accuracy per level of dungeon. So if you're fighting level 6 dungeons, you're going to want about 60 accuracy. Okay, when you're fighting level 10 dungeons, you're going to want 100 accuracy. When you're at level 20 dungeons, you want 200 accuracy. And that's pretty much as far as your starter's usually going to get you. You can go up to 25 in dungeons and about 250 accuracy, but your starters will sort of start falling off by that point for sure. So yeah, that's something to bear in mind. But it's also a consideration with your starters. You're going to have to put accuracy on them to make them land their debuffs, which means that you're not going to be able to put gear on them that increases their attack as much. So just bear that in the back of your mind as well. Anyway, let's look at Aethel, who I think is a little bit weaker, but she attacks one enemy 3 times on her A1, and she puts 25% weaken debuff. Now, compared to Galek, this makes her quite a bit better, because weaken is pretty rare, right? Weaken is quite rare to get, and it's very good. It makes them just take more damage. So 25% weaken is on a boss. That boss takes 25% more damage from essentially everything that you do. Not quite, but most things. It's a lot of extra damage on that single target, so this actually makes her pretty good against bosses. Her AoE attack attacks all enemies, 15% extra chance of inflicting a crit, 3-turn cooldown, so it doesn't have the speed buff like Alek had, so it's a bit weaker in that sense. And then her special moves, a 4-turn cooldown when booked, it's Higher Blessing, gives her 25% increased attack for 2 turns, 30% increased defense as well for 2 turns if her current HP is less than 50%, and gives her an extra turn. That's the best bit. So the increased defense is the worst part. Her defense is pretty bad, and if she's less than half health, she's probably just going to die anyway, to be honest. So it's not great, and it's situational. I don't like that bit. 25% increased attack buff is okay early on in the game. You can get a better increased attack buff. You can get champions that give you 50% increased attack, and that's a very good idea to try get one of those on your team pretty quickly as well. So again, for example, they'll come in, they'll increase attack, War Maiden does the decreased defense on the enemy, and then your starter nukes them with their AoE. Boom, great. So this is good early on, but it doesn't stack with a bigger increased attack, so it falls off pretty quick. The extra turn is pretty nice. It does mean that her buffs fall off faster, but it also means debuffs fall off faster, and more importantly, getting an extra turn knocks a turn cooldown off of her AoE, so it gets her back to her AoE attack a bit faster, which is pretty decent. It's not too bad. It's not too bad at all. And yeah, I think that Aethel is okay, but I do think she's one of the weaker too. Good against bosses with a weaken, but we'll see when we look at her damage that her damage is just lower in general, especially because that increased attack buff is not really holding up. Then this is going to surprise people, but I actually think that Kael is, for me, rank 2, which is a bit crazy, okay? This is a bit crazy because he is traditionally the best starter champion in the game, and I think he's... The top 2 here, I think, are vying for first place. So his A1 Dark Bolt attacks one enemy and has, when booked, a 100% chance of putting a 2.5% poison debuff for 2 turns. Whenever that enemy takes a turn, they're going to take 2.5% of their max health in damage from that poison. So this is pretty good. Very good against bosses who have tons of health. This will actually add up to a lot of damage. Pretty nice. Then his AoE attack, 3-turn cooldown AoE, surprise, surprise, extra chance to crit, surprise, surprise, and it fills his turn meter by 25% for each enemy killed. This is actually great because he is going to be the person who is killing people, so it's going to help him take turns much faster in arena, in campaign, in dungeons. This is pretty fantastic. And then his big special move, 4-turn cooldown, attacks 4 times at random, so it's like Alex, but 1 turn shorter cooldown, and this also has a 50% chance when it's booked up of putting a 5% poison debuff for 2 turns. This is the big poison debuff. So that, yeah, I mean, that's like, if you hit the same target with all 4 hits, on average, you're going to put 2 of these poisons. So they're going to be taking 10% of their max HP per turn for 2 turns. Pretty nice for melting down those bosses, and that's where he really shines. And then in my opinion, which is a bold choice, because a lot of people consider her the weakest starter, but I actually think she's the best, and I'll show you the secret stats as to why, is Elhain in the High Elves. Her A1 is a single target attack. It actually hits twice if she crits, and you want to obviously build her to crit. Her A2 then, this is where it gets a bit weird. I'm going to jump ahead to her A3. Her A3 is her big AoE attack, 3-turn cooldown. The weird thing here is it doesn't have the bonus crit rate. That's actually on her special move, right? Lightning Arrow, 4-turn cooldown when it's booked. This attacks one enemy and then does an AoE attack hitting all enemies. This has the extra chance to crit, and it gives her a 30% increased crit rate buff for 3 turns if she kills a target. This is not, the extra crit rate is not very useful. Very good for your first like week or so of playing, where her crit rate's gonna be pretty low. But once you get further on, you're really going to want to be building her with 85% crit, if not 100% crit rate. So this crit rate overcaps and does nothing. So that's not great. But this is a second AoE attack, which for me is what sets her apart, is that unlike all the other starter champions, she has 2 AoEs. Now then, there's a bit more to it than that. Let's get a little bit nerdy here. One thing I want to show you, you can check out a website like hellhades.com, and this will show you the secret stats. And I'm going to show you it on a spreadsheet because I'm nerdy, which will really make it clear. And I'll also have the rankings on the spreadsheet for where these champions are good. But for example, the way that damage works is that it's going to go in, it's going to take the, where's Elhain? It's going to take the attack stat of your champion, and then it's going to multiply it by the secret number, which is going to be the damage that they actually do. And this is obviously increased by gear as well, so it adds gear on as well. So for Kayle, for example, he has a 3.5 times attack multiplier on his A1, 4.65 times attack on his AoE hit, and then a 1.5 times attack on his 4 hitter. It does hit 4 times though, for a total of 6 times attack damage. This is going to be pretty intimidating, but fuck it, we're jumping in to the spreadsheet. The spreadsheets come out, but this breaks it down with example damage, and let me show you some things, right? So let's look at just the A1s first of all, going from worst to best. Galek only has a 3 times attack multiplier in his A1. Next best is Kayle with 3.5, then there's Aethel with 3.9, then Elhain has a monstrous A1 attack with 4.4, and this has a big impact on the damage. So Galek, for example damage, he's going to do 4,500. Kayle's going to come in, he's going to do 5,400. Aethel's going to do 5,900, and then Elhain's going to slam in about 7,000 damage. This is like a simulation with sample stats against a fairly typical enemy, right? And then similar things as well. When we look at their AoE, it's actually pretty similar. So the AoE attack, 4.4 for Elhain for 6,900. Kayle is a 4.65 for 7,000. Aethel 4.1 for 6,400, and then Galek is 4.5 for 7,000. I'm also factored into this, by the way, is when you upgrade their abilities with skill books, they do more damage, up to like between 20 to 25% for these particular starter champions. And then with their extra effects as well. And then you can see their single target hits too. So for example, Kayle's A3 with the 4 random hits will do a total of 9,000 damage. Galek hits a bit harder. Kayle is a 1.5 times 4. Galek has 1.6 on each of those hits. He does a bit more damage. Elhain, interesting enough, she'll slam her first target for, I think it's a 4.0 single target hit, and then she'll follow it up with a 2.2 AoE. So in total, it's going to do, let me actually make that clear, 4.0 single. I'll put this in the description. So 4.0 on the single target, add on the 2.2 AoE, so against a single target, she'll do 9,300. But also bear in mind it has that AoE effect. In terms of the raw damage then, when you actually break it down, you see some pretty dramatic things, okay? So Aethel is the worst in single target and raw damage. Kayle and Galek are pretty similar. Galek hits a bit harder on his 4-hitter and his AoE, but his A1 is worse. Kayle hits harder in his A1. He's a little bit ahead. But Elhain comes way ahead in terms of raw damage. We're not including debuffs like the poison here, but in terms of raw damage, Elhain is way ahead. When we go to the average AoE damage per turn, it's even more stark. Again, Aethel is a bit behind. She just doesn't hit as hard. Galek and Kayle are pretty similar. And then Elhain is way ahead, simply because, you know, this 4-hitter at random is going to do 9,000 damage no matter what. Whereas this one in here, Elhain is going to do 9,000 damage, and then if there's 2 additional targets, she's going to do another 2.2 times 2, so 4.4. She's going to do another 7,000 if there's more targets. So she starts pulling way ahead in that raw damage for AoE. You might be saying, man, I see why you picked Elhain as your best champion now. Like, she seems way better. Well, one slight difference, and again, the thing that really brings this together is, for me, the 3 areas that you're going to be running your starter. You've got campaign farming. So a campaign farm is going to be something like, usually you want to ultimately get up to stage 12, Brimstone Path stage 3 on brutal difficulty. And I have a legendary in here. I probably should have put in my starter, my Galek. But you do something like this, and you can see it's very easy. You're going to rip through. This is going to be way faster because this is a Void Legendary, one of the hardest champions in the game to get. But you're going to rip through fast, and this is how you're going to level up champions, defeat the champions to power them up, blah, blah, blah. So campaign, honestly, they're all for me pretty equal in campaign. But then we've got dungeons. So dungeons, you're going to be fighting waves like that of weak enemies. But then there's also going to be these bosses, and these bosses are pretty tough. You also have clan bosses. The Hydra is way too hard. Don't worry about it. This guy is the one you're probably going to be fighting, which is the Demon Lord. And your starters are going to be pretty okay for like easy, normal, maybe even hard, but they're going to really fall off then, apart from Kael and Aethel, who have some use with their debuffs. And then you've got Arena, which is where you're going to be fighting other players and faction wars and stuff too. But they're the three main areas: dungeons and Arena and bosses. So what I've done is I have ranked them based off of this, and it's I think pretty clear as well. So for killing waves of enemies like campaign or the dungeon waves, I think Elhain is the best. She just does the most AoE damage, right? So I give her an A. For B, I actually put Kael as the next best. Why? Because his AoE attack gives him a bunch of turn meter on kill, and he will be killing people, so he's just going to be taking more turns than your other champions and doing more damage. And then in C, we've got Galek. Galek does give himself increased speed. That's nice. Aethel will take extra turns and get back to her AoE a bit faster now and then. That's not too bad either, but they're a bit behind Kael. So yeah, I think Elhain is a bit ahead there. When it comes to actually fighting bosses, though, I think that Kael and Aethel are the best. So fighting dungeon bosses or fighting the clan boss, the Demon Lord. Kael, in my opinion, is the best overall because he brings poisons, and those poisons really rip through that health. Aethel is a close second because of Weaken, and Weaken is just difficult to get. 25% more damage from all sources, most sources, against the boss. That's really good too. So Aethel is really good for bosses, even though her average damage is quite a bit lower. Just upping your team's damage is very valuable. Elhain comes in at a B for me here because she just does tons of raw damage, but it's just not going to equal the damage that Kael does with poisons against bosses. But she's still good. And then Galek is the weakest one. He does okay single target damage, but not as much as Elhain, and he just doesn't bring the poison debuffs like Kael. He doesn't bring a weaken. Decreased defense is easy to get from other champions, so he's the weakest against bosses. And then for Arena, I think Elhain is just way ahead, right? Way ahead. And you can build her two ways, really. You can build her for A2. So you could go like, okay, I'm fighting another player. I'm going to nuke, let's say they have Kael. I'm going to smack Kael for 6.2 targeted damage, right? These random hits, you can't target someone. With her thing, you can. You can go, I want Kael to die, smack him for 6.2 damage, and do an AoE hit on the rest of them. They're weakened up, they're softened. I've just killed their damage dealer, so he can't attack me. We survive, and then she comes in and slams them with another AoE hit. She is by far the best AoE, the best Arena champion of the starters. I think that Kael and Galek are second up. Galek, his AoE does hit the hardest up front. He's got the hardest AoE by a small margin, which is nice. And the increased speed can be somewhat useful to help him get around to his turn a bit faster. Kael is probably a bit better than him, actually, because if he kills someone, he's going to get some turn meter and then get into his attacks again while the enemy team is still reeling. And then Aethel is just, I think, by far the weakest. Her AoE hits the weakest. She'll pop an extra turn then after that, but it's going to take her a while to get around. So she's much weaker for Arena. Definitely a C, if not a D tier in Arena. Honestly, let's be mean to Aethel. Let's put her down there. C, let's put D tier for Aethel. She's way worse. Way worse. So yeah, you put all this stuff together. My recommendations, I think, avoid Aethel. I think Aethel is... A lot of people think she may even be the strongest starter. I disagree. I think she's the weakest. She's got the worst damage output on a personal level. She's by far the weakest in Arena. I think that makes her not good enough. She's great against bosses, but Kael also is great against bosses too, and he's better in other areas. He's much better in Arena and against waves, so I would go for Kael instead. Kael, I think, is great. Kael's a great choice. He's flexible, right? You can not build any accuracy, just build him for damage, and he'll do huge damage, right? He'll do great damage. Not as much as Elhain, but he'll still be really good. He'll still smack an Arena. He'll be great. He'll do that job. Alternatively, you can build up his defenses a bit, you can build up his accuracy, and he'll be much better against bosses, but his damage does fall off a bit. So it's kind of like he's being pulled in two directions is the downside for Kayle. That's what makes him number 2 for me, is that if you want him to do damage, you've got to ditch his accuracy. Then his debuffs don't do anything, and Elhain just does more raw damage. If you want him to do his debuffs, which are great, he'll do a little bit less raw damage. It's going to fall off even relative to this. But it's that flexibility that does make him good, that you can kind of shape him to the teams that you need, and he'll probably remain relevant for a little bit longer than the others. Galek, I think, is also a very weak choice, unfortunately. He's just not great. He's just not great. His debuff isn't that good. He's got a longer cooldown on his special move. 5-turn cooldown's pretty rough. Yeah, he does hit hard. He's going to be solid for Arena, which is the area that these champions will be relevant for the longest. But not great. And then I think Elhain is, in my opinion, the best, just because she's the best raw damage. Nuking through waves, which is most of what you want her to do. Her boss damage is actually still pretty good, just in raw damage. It's solid. And then she's the best one for Arena, which is probably the last area that these starters are going to be phased out. Right? You're going to phase them out probably against Clan Boss first. You're going to get better champions. Kayle will hang on the longest, or Aethel if you need the weekend. They'll hang on longer, but they will get phased out by better poisoners that you can get pretty quickly. They'll get phased out probably there first. Then they'll probably get phased out of dungeons as you get better dungeon champions. They'll probably hang on in Arena for quite a while because they are fast and they do hit hard. And that for me is why Elhain is number 1. But there you go. The Nerdy Look team. The Nerdy Look. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think. Again, this is a bit crazy because most people consider Elhain to be pretty weak. And I think she doesn't get chosen much because I think she gets eaten by the dragon in the starter cutscene and you go, wow, she kind of sucks. But she's actually fantastic. Best AoE damage dealer of the lot. And for me, that is what makes her the best. So guys, thank you for watching. Good luck. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you did. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.